Generation 4. There are many ways to describe it. Incredibly nostalgic, the best generation, aggravatingly slow. But no matter what, when trying to find the moment where Pokemon really began to change into what it is now, they'd all probably say Generation 4. In a way, it was sort of a progressive era for Pokemon, introducing things such as the physical special split, much better move pools, and the first 3D graphics in the main series games. But despite all of these improvements, some of the new Pokemon still suffer the same problems that older ones did, making them difficult to use in a Gen 4 playthrough. And some are, to this day, still incredibly underwhelming. This is actually part 4 of my Fixing Bad Pokemon series, so if you enjoy, make sure to watch the other videos I made for the first 3 generations. But now, let's take a look at Gen 4's most forgotten and underwhelming Pokemon. Okay, I know that I'm gonna get a lot of hate comments for this. After all, what in the world is Luxray of all Gen 4 Pokemon doing in a video discussing underwhelming Pokemon? It's probably one of the last Pokemon you'd even give the word underwhelming to, since nearly everyone uses it in their playthroughs. And yeah, don't get me wrong, Luxray is a solid team member, but I honestly think one of the main reasons why it gets used in everybody's team is because it's one of the few electric types in Sinnoh at all. In Diamond and Pearl, its competition consists of Pachirisu and Raichu. And look at its stats, they're great for an early game Pokemon, right? Yeah, they are. So what's the big deal here? What kind of a clown is making this video? Well, Luxray's one big issue is its severe lack of coverage in Gen 4, even for an electric type, which is saying a lot. Its level of move list consists of just electric and dark type moves, which isn't horrible, but the problem lies in the fact that despite being meant to be a hard-hitting physical attacker, it's really hard to say that with its lack of strong stab moves. When your best electric move is a 65 base power Spark, that 120 attack stat suddenly seems not as good. The first thing I change is the obvious. Give it an extra dark typing. Yeah, it's cliche at this point, and at first glance, it doesn't make a ton of sense. But I think its color scheme and mystical ability to see through walls justifies giving it a magical secondary type like Dark. This would also fix its lack of good stab options, as now it would be able to use Crunch more effectively. Speaking of types, it needs a lot more type coverage. The first 3 moves I'd give would be the Elemental Fangs as level 1 moves, which is honestly a no-brainer decision given that many other fanged Pokemon get it at level 1, so I don't understand why Luxray can't get it at level 1 too. I'd also give it Howl as an early game move since its dex entry in Legend states that they live in packs, Extra Sensory to illustrate its supernatural ability to see through walls, Sucker Punch since it's able to sneak up on enemies in the dark, and lastly Dig because for some completely bizarre reason it's just never been able to learn it, despite its feline appearance. Finally, we need to get rid of Rivalry. It's far too situational to do any good, and it usually just ends up as a cripple to Luxray in most playthroughs. I think instead, No Guard is fitting, seeing as pretty much all of its dex entries state that it has X-ray vision, so being able to detect any prey regardless of if it's underground or flying would make sense. It also would make all of its Fang moves 100% accurate, which is good. Luxray was never a bad Pokemon in Gen 4, but its wasted potential to be a whole lot better is pretty unfortunate. Sadly though, I can't really say the same for the rest in this video. Let's be real here. Being a pure water type is hard. You're the blandest of the bland, having the most common type in the game and not having an extra type to distinguish yourself. There are quite a few pure water types I can think of that have become forgotten, such as Seeking, Golduck, and Luvdisc. So of course, in Gen 4, they decided to add yet another one to spend its days flopping in this sad little boat. This of course being the poor Lumineon. To give you an idea of how underwhelming it is, it's become notorious because of how forgotten it was. And that makes sense given its mediocre stats besides speed. It's a shame because I really love Lumineon, and I think there are some ways to help it. Firstly, we need some small stat boosts. I'd increase its speed by 10 to give it a cheeky base 101 speed, and increase its special attack by 20 so that it can actually deal damage. My second upgrade for it is a big one, but for newer games, I would give it a second fairy typing. Its dex entries constantly mention its dazzling lights and beautiful appearance, so while it's not the strongest contender for a fairy typing, it's certainly more deserving of it than some others. As for moves, there's a ton of wasted potential here. The fact that it can produce bright lights makes me feel like it should get Charge Beam and Confuse Ray since they're both Ray-like moves. Speaking of rays and light, it could also get Psy Beam, Aurora Beam, Signal Beam, and Flash Cannon, giving it a lot more much-needed coverage. And lastly, for a good setup move, it could get Tail Glow. I know this doesn't sound like it makes any sense, but it's never explicitly stated that the light has to come from its tail in the move descriptions. In later games, it could get Quiver Dance as a second option to boost, along with Dazzling Gleam and Moonblast for a fairy-type stab. Lumineon has always been a Pokemon strictly there just to exist, just to add extra ambience to the Pokemon world. But I think with these changes, Lumineon could actually be a decent threat and a valuable team member. As I said earlier, Generation 4 was the moment where most Pokemon finally got wide move pools, and there's no other type that got a bigger buff than the Bug type. Prior to Gen 4, the Bug type seemed to solely exist to teach players not to use it. There were very few good Bug type moves, and the ones that were good usually were only learnable by a few Bug type Pokemon. But in Gen 4, we finally got good, accessible Bug moves in X-Scissor, U-Turn, and Bug Buzz. Still though, some bug types never really got to shine despite these major improvements, and a prime example of this is Wormadam. I'll be honest, I always liked Burmy and Wormadam's designs. I think the gimmick of Wormadam's type being based on where it evolved is really neat. Sadly, what isn't so neat are its stats. A 424 base stat total for a Pokemon that you have to wait 6 real-life hours to obtain? You might as well beat the game at that time. Anyway, let's try and make this thing somewhat viable in a playthrough. If you saw my Fixing Gen 3 Pokemon video, you probably remember how I made Castform's 3 forms have different stat distributions. Well, conveniently, Wormadam's 3 forms already have different distributions, so all I'm really going to do is increase their base stat totals by 40. They're clearly meant to be defensive, slow Pokemon that specialize either in physical or special moves, but their current stats just don't reflect that strongly enough. I'd increase the Grass Cloak's special defense and attack by 20, the Sandy Cloak's physical defense and attack by 20, and both of the Trash Cloak's defenses by 20. As for moves, here's where I'd have them seriously diverge. Knowing that they're all defensive Pokemon, the Plant Cloak should get Giga Drain, Leech Seed, and Toxic Spikes by level up. The Sandy Cloak should get Earthquake, Stealth Rock, and Sandstorm, and the Trash Cloak should get Metal Burst, Gyro Ball, Spikes, and Curse. As for level up moves that all 3 of them could learn, I'd give them Sucker Punch as a reference to their cloak being great for camouflage, as well as Stockpile, Swallow, and Spit Up since they collect their surrounding materials for their cloaks. And I know that some of you are probably wondering about Mothim, the male counterpart. Well, I'll be honest, Mothim is more of a lost cause since there are so many other Pokemon who are just better than it. But I guess the logical answer is to give it more speed, Sleep Powder, and Compound Eyes. Lastly, I think giving Wormadam Thick Fat or Magic Guard as a second ability would be cool. Thick Fat is to reduce its ice and fire weaknesses since it has a thick cloak, and while Magic Guard seems strange for a normal looking bug Pokemon, for some unknown reason, Wormadam can learn Psychic and Ghost attacks, so I feel like they have some sort of magical powers hidden in their cloaks, or at least the cloak itself has some magical properties. I know it's a lot of buffs for an early game Pokemon, but honestly, is it really early game if you have to wait 6 hours to get one? Wormadam deserved so much more than what it got. You know, Gen 4 has a lot of very popular Pokemon, and it's honestly kinda difficult trying to think of forgettable Gen 4 Pokemon. Yes, Lumineon is often the target of being the most forgotten Pokemon in history, but that alone has given it a newfound reputation. But one Pokemon that has really fallen through the cracks of obscurity is Carnivine. I'm sure you've heard of it, but how many of you have actually used one on a team? Actually, how many of you even know where to catch it in Gen 4? Well, I'll tell you where it is, the Great Marsh. Of course, being one of the hardest Pokemon to find, but even if you did catch one, you'd be rewarded with a disappointing team member. Just like many of the Pokemon mentioned above, one of Carnivine's biggest problems is its stats. It's basically the Seviper of grass types, being a solid mixed attacker with mediocre defenses and poor speed. However, unlike Seviper, I think making it a glass cannon doesn't fit with its behavior as it mostly spends its time waiting for prey to come near. So I don't think giving it a lot of speed would make sense. I also really don't see why it has 90 special attacks since almost all of its level up moves are physical, and I mean, its whole thing is chomping on prey, so I'd lower it to 60 while raising its physical attack by 10, its HP by 10, and both of its defenses by 10. But that's not Carnivine's biggest problem. Like a lot of other grass types, it suffers from having a shallow move pool. Having Crunch for dark type coverage is nice, but just like Luxray, I'd go as far as to give it the 3 elemental fangs, but instead only as move reminder moves, since this decision is a bit out there compared to Luxray. I also think giving it poison attacks like Poison Fang and Gunk Shot would work well given that Venus flytraps use acid to dissolve their prey, and for those wanting to deal with its low speed, it could also get Sucker Punch to lean into the fact that Carnivine traps prey by surprise. In newer games, it could also get String Sap to reference its method of eating, as well as Snap Trap because, I mean, it's a Venus fly trap. Lastly, while Levitate isn't a bad ability, it doesn't help Carnivine all that much given that it already resists ground moves. Instead, it should get Arena Trap as its second ability because, again, fly trap. And for a hidden ability in newer games, Strong Jaw would be fun to boost its biting attacks. I don't think Carnivine will become the next top tier threat, but it'll at least make it a worthy reward for players who decide to catch one, instead of being one of the most forgettable Pokemon in existence. But now, it's time to go to the very bottom of the barrel and talk about, literally, the weakest Gen 4 Pokemon. Everyone's favorite musical catastrophe, Kricketune. Now, before you rush to the comments, yes, I know, it's an early game bug who isn't supposed to be incredible. Yes, it becomes fully evolved at just level 10. But you know who else becomes fully evolved at level 10? Butterfree. You know who else are early game bugs that can pull their way through an entire playthrough? Heracross, Leavanny, Ninjask, and of course, the aforementioned Butterfree. There's no excuse, it's just laughably weak, having a gag-inducing 384 base stat total. Not to mention that you have to deal with Kricketot for several levels, who doesn't even get a proper attacking move before evolving. Again, I get that it's not supposed to be the biggest powerhouse, but I'd take almost any other early game bug over Kricketune. This thing needs a complete makeover, and I think I have an idea. The first thing I do to patch it up is to rearrange its stats. Its stat distribution is really awkward and doesn't make much sense. A slow, frail physical attacker with strangely high HP compared to its other stats? What is it supposed to do? I think its physical defense should be raised by 40 and its special defense by 20, which design-wise fits because crickets have hard exoskeletons. Next, I'd actually lower its physical attack to 75. I'll explain this change later. A base stat total of 434 is still low, but it's a lot better than the nearly useless bug we currently have. Now, as for moves, here's where Kricketune's design will finally come to life. Being an orchestra conductor, I'd imagine Kricketune's primary role to be to support the rest of its team, or rather, its orchestra. So why not give it some basic support moves like Reflect and Light Screen, as well as more flavorful stuff like Heal Bell, Encore, and Baton Pass to demonstrate its musical side. For its attacks, it could get moves involving its 2 sharp arms such as Karate Chop, Air Slash, Cross Poison, and Twin Needle. Lastly, and most importantly, its abilities. Swarm doesn't really help a slow Pokemon like Kricketune, and I feel like it's just the generic ability given to so many bug types. And it doesn't even thematically fit Kricketune's design. Starting in Gen 5, it also gets Technician as a hidden ability, but I would straight up replace Swarm with it since I'm pretty sure that being a skilled musician, it probably has the proper technique to use its attacks more effectively. But for its second ability, I wanted to give it something unique. So much like I did with Magcargo and Dugong, it's gonna get a custom ability which I'll name Soloist. What it does is, if Kricketune is the last remaining member, its attack and speed will be raised by 1 stage, making its nerfed 75 base attack way stronger, but it'll only activate if there are more than 1 Pokemon in your team. This makes you choose between using Kricketune as either a supportive setup Pokemon or using it as a trump card that could win you a battle. Maybe then, Kricketune will actually be sought after for once. Or, I guess would is the right word to use here, because as fun as it is to come up with buffs to underwhelming Pokemon, until Game Freak decides to retroactively buff more older Pokemon, they'll just be collecting dust in the bottom of the ever-increasing bin of options to use. I'm sure there are lots of you whose favorite Pokemon are some of the underdogs, and personally, I love using lesser-used Pokemon in playthroughs, but still, I'd wish that they'd all get a chance to shine and get some love, because at the end of the day, we all deserve that.